So this week is Parshas Tetzaveh. Last week, Parshas Trimah, we learned the mitzvah of a Komis Mishkan, and this week's Parsha starts with Big Day Kahuna. And the topic we will be discussing today is an interesting and fascinating one. Min HaMutar B'ficha. So Masechet Shabbos Chov Chesed Amud Aleph, the Gemara discusses what type of an animal was the Tachash. The Tachash was an animal of the hide, the skin of the animal. They did the Yerias HaMishkan. Was the Tachash a chayet tohira or a chayet tomeya? Was it permissible to eat its meat? Was it a pure animal or an impure animal? And the Gemara says, it must have been a chayet tohira, because otherwise, how could you use its hide for the Mishkan? It must be min HaMutar B'ficha. So the Pasuk says, Lamanti Torah Hashem B'ficha, and the Gemara says, Lo yihuchsharu lemelechas shemayim ela or behemet tahora belvad. For melechas shemayim, and melechas shemayim seems to be a general concept which needs to be clearly defined, but the Gemara says, Lo yihuchsharu lemelechas shemayim ela or behemet tahora. And the Gemara says that has nothing to do with the Mishkan or the Beis HaMikdash. This halacha is specific to tefillin. And what the halacha says is that the ritzuos of tefillin must be made from the hide of a behemoth tahira. Let me just note that the posuk Lamanti Torah Hashem B'ficha refers to mitzvahs tefillin. We are to put on tefillin Lamanti Torah Hashem B'ficha. So the Gemara says, this drosha, that Melechas Shemayim must be min HaMutar B'ficha, refers to tefillin and tefillin only. But then the Gemara once again asks, what about the Tachash? Was it a chayet tahira, chayet tomeya? And the Meskona is chayet tahira. Rabbeinu B'ficha, in his Perush on the Chumash, says, why didn't they use silk in Big Day Kehena, Big Day Meshi? So silk is the most beautiful garment, the most beautiful material, because silk is produced by worms, and worms are shrotzim, so it's not min HaMutar B'ficha. That is why they didn't use silk. So Rabbeinu B'ficha asks, so what about Tolas Shoni? Tolas Shoni seems to be material that is produced by toiloim, by worms, silkworms or other worms. So if they didn't use silk because it's not min HaMutar B'ficha, what about Tolas Shoni? And Rabbeinu B'ficha says a big chiddush. Tolas Shoni is min hatzomeach, not min hachai. It's not produced by worms. It's actually a plant or a seed. Min hatzomeach. So why is it called Tolas Shoni? So I'm quoting the Lashon of Rabbeinu B'ficha, and Rabbeinu B'ficha says, Tzeva Tolas Shoni eino megufa tolat, elo metoch gargarim shatoloim bitocham. And Rabbeinu B'ficha isn't the first one to define Tolas Shoni as being a tzomeach and not a chai. Rashi, Sefer Yeshayahu, Perek Aleph Posek Yud Ches, Emiyach hatuechem keshonim kesheleg yalbinu emiyadimu ketoilo ketzemer yiyo. Rashi explains, what does toila mean? Imyadimu ketoila. And I'm reading Rashi. Tzeva shetzava by odoim. Gar'inem hem. V'yesh toiloim b'kol echod v'yechod. And the same we find in the Rambam. Hilchas Poradima. Poraduma perigimel halocha beis. Shni toiloas is associated with the Azov of Taharas Apora. And I quote the Rambam. Atoilas, he. הגרגרים האדומים ביוסר, הדוימים לגרעיני החרובים, ותולס כמו יתוש יש בכל גרגיר מהם. רש"י, פרק א' ישעיהו, רמב"ם פורדימה. רבנו B'ficha, שני תולס. תולס שוני is not produced by worms. It's a seed. Why is it called תולס שוני? Because in each and every one of those seeds there is a tiny little worm, a tiny little insect. But the Rambam seems to contradict Divrei Atzmai. Perikas Aloch Yud Gimel. Regarding Big Day Kahuna, the Rambam's interpretation of Tolas Shoni is, V'Tolas Shoni hu hatzemer hatzavua betolas. Hatzavua betolas. So the Rambam obviously doesn't agree with Rabbeinu B'ficha, and obviously, Shni Tolas of Poraduma is a different species than Tolas Shoni of Big Day Kahuna. That's the way we need to learn the Rambam. So obviously the Rambam agrees with the Rashba on Shabbos of Chav Ches. The Rashba says, according to the Maskonas Sugya, it is only Ritzuos Tefillin that need to be made of a behemoth tahira. And this din of HaMutar B'ficha refers to Tefillin and to Tefillin only. And therefore we have no problem with the Beis HaMikdash. However, the Ran, Rosh Hashanah Davov Medape Arif, disagrees, and the Ran is Mesupik. Is a shofar kosher if it's made from an impure antelope, from a chayet tameya? Would the shofar be kosher? And the Ran, just like the Rashba says, l'choira, the Sugya Masechet Shabbos proves this halacha refers only to tefillin and not to anything else. V'yaf al piken, the Ran is mesupak, and the Ramah Simen Tov Kuf Pei Vav Sif Alav Paskins shofar machayet tameya is pasul. Mogan Avraham Sif Koten Gimel brings the Oile Shabbos, wonders how could the Ramah give such a psak? In the Gemara in Shabbos, it's obvious that it refers only to tefillah, not to shofar or to other mitzvahs. The Mogan Avraham rejects the Oile Shabbos, and the Mogan Avraham quotes the Gemara in Kedushin Lamed Hey, dealing with a totally different sugya. Mitzvahs say Shazman Groma, but the Gemara says Iskeshu kol ha-mitzvahs litfilin. The Mogan Avraham says the same regarding HaMutar B'ficha. The Posik deals with Tefillin, but we learn all other mitzvahs from Tefillin. That's a psak of the Ramo. And this brings us to various different interesting questions. So the Noide B'Yehuda, very first siman in his Gewaldige Sefer, Madura Kama, Orechaim Siman Aleph, towards the end of the Tshuva, he deals with Tefillin that was colored by dye, by tseva, in which part of the tseva was made out of bones of an elephant that were crushed into the tseva. And that's not min HaMutar B'ficha. So, the Noide B'Yehuda says, maybe because it's just color, there is no kpeida. Chazuta lav milta. That's a concept we find many times in Shas, primarily in Bava Kama Daf Kuf Aleph, and also in Psochim Daf Kuf Aleph Kol Mara V'Reach Ein Behem Mishum Me'ila. So, because it's just the coloring of the tefillin, maybe there is no kpeida. It's just color. Well, Reb Shmuel Lando, the great son of the Noide B'Yehuda, he was his father's, he was the Rav in Prague after his great father passed away. He was one of the Gedolei Yisrael in his own merit. He has a Sefer Shalas Tshuvas Shiva Sion, and he deals with this concept of min HaMutar B'ficha, Noide B'Yehuda Madura Tinyona, Orachaim Simen Gimel, and Shalas Tshuvas Shiva Sion is his own Sefer in Orachaim Simen Beis. And he further elaborates on his father's chiddush that chazuta in itself is not a kpeida. Does that fit in with Shalas Tshuvas Dvar Shmuel, one of the great achronim, Siman Kuf Samach Beis, Kuf Samach Daled, and he deals with dio, the ink in which we wrote a Sefer Torah, and there are ingredients that are also ba'achila. I think the ink is not just color. That is the essence. That is the ikar mitzvahs Talmud Torah, is the oisias, the letters, the askorois. That is the essence of the mitzvah. That's the chefs of the mitzvah. It's not like the coloring of tefillin. Kach nere poshut. So the Noide B'Yehuda asks, what about tcheles? What about tcheles? The tcheles is produced by a snail, a chalozain, and that's a sheretz. So if Rabbeinu Bachya says they couldn't use silk, how could they use tcheles? So Rabbi Shmuel Landa wants to prove his father's point. It's just color. Rabbeinu Bachya deals with making the garments big dekena from silk as a material, not coloring. Coloring there is no kpeida, and that is why they use the tcheles. But Reb Shmuel, the son of the Noide B'Yehuda, also argues that maybe the chalozon of the tcheles is mutar b'achila, because the Gemara says doimer adag. That's a very weak argument. It's a snail. It's not a fish. It's doimer adag. So in all likelihood, and there's an issur of shrotzim. So the Noide B'Yehuda and his son both argue coloring makes no difference. Rambam, Hilchas Klei Migdosh Perek Aleph Halacha Gimel. the Rambam explains how do we make Shemen HaMishcha. One of the ingredients of Shemen HaMishcha is mor. And the Rambam says, I'm reading the Lashon of the Rambam, Hamoru Adam Atzoror B'chaya Shebahodu. There's an animal in India, and from the blood of this animal, that's mor. The Ravid disagrees. And the Ravid writes, Ein dati mekabeles sheyikansu b'maseh hegdish dam shum chaya b'yolam v'kol sheken dam chaya tomeo. So the Ravid says, mor is actually a plant. Min hatzomeach lo min hachai. Kesef Mishnah says, everybody knows that mor is musk. And it's not dam, because the dam was totally transformed into a different fluid. I think about 2 months ago I gave a shiur about ponim chadoshois be'isur ve'heter b'machalot asurot. I think we brought about 15 different sources in this gewaldige sugya. And one of the most important sources is the Rosh Broches Perek Vav Siman Lamed Hey. Machlokes the Ben Yoin and other Rishonim is musk a material that is permitted for consumption. So musk is primarily used in as a perfume, but also as an ingredient in food. So the Rishonim say it comes from dam, so there's an issa dam. And Rabbi Yoni says ponim chadoshas bo'olakan. Originally it was dam, but in a biological process, a natural process, the dam is transformed into a different fluid, different taste, different smell, different coloring, totally different. And the Kesef Mishnah argues the same. Mor is musk. Ponim chadoshas bo'olakan v'nishtane legamra. And therefore, it is permissible to be used in Shemen HaMishcha. The Noida B'Yehuda, as well as the Chassam Sofer Tshuvas HaChaim Siman Lamed Tes. Noida B'Yehuda says, well, Retzua Shebetfilin are all so different. And after Piken, the Gemara says, they must be made from a Chayat Torah because HaMutar B'ficha. The Chassam Sofer asks, how do we use silk in our shuls? The Me'ir of a Sefer Torah, the Paroiches and the Yoren Kodesh. So once again, the Chassam Sofer says, Nishtana legamra. No. I disagree with the Noida B'Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer. What the Kesef Mishnah means, what Rabbeinu Yoina means, is when in a natural process, a substance is altered by biology in a natural process, similar to what Chazal say, the source of milk, the origin of milk, dam necha v'nasa cholav. This gland in this animal transforms blood into musk. That is ponim chadoshois, not when you produce things and they're slightly changed. Hide is hide. Retzuas and tefillin are made of hide. It's not ponim chadoshes. It's polished. It's refined. It is changed to a certain degree, but we cannot say ponim chadoshes. And the same with a me'il of a sefer Torah. Silk is silk. It's the natural silk. Yes, it's not threads of silk as worms produce. It's a garment, but the silk is the same. The hide is the same. It is not in any way similar to blood that's transformed into a totally different fluid that does not have the characteristics of blood. Kach nera poshut la'aniyas daiti. Regarding the Chassam Sofer's kasha, I don't understand the kasha at all, because a me'il of a sefer Torah or any other thing we make of silk in our shuls is a tashmish de tashmish. You know, there are two different concepts, tashmish kedusha and tashmish mitzvah. Two different levels of kedusha and different halachas. Tefillin, sefer Torah, tashmish kedusha. You can't go to the bathroom wearing tefillin, but you could go to the bathroom wearing tzitzis. But so tzitzis is defined as tashmish mitzvah, not tashmish kedusha. According to the Ran, even tashmish mitzvah must be min HaMutar B'ficha. He talks about a shofar. which is not Tashmish Kedusha, but rather Tashmish Mitzvah. But in our shuls, we use silk that is Tashmish de Tashmish. It's not a Chefze de Mitzvah. It's not like it's not like Shofar. So the entire kasha of the Chassam Sofer is difficult to appreciate and to understand. Now the Noida B'Yehuda disagrees with the Ramah, and he says by a shofar there is no din of HaMutar B'ficha. How does he prove that? Sukkah Chov Gimel. The Gemara says you could make a doifen of a sukkah from the side of an elephant. The elephant is the biggest land animal we have in the world. So the side of an elephant is like a wall. And that could be a doifen of sukkah. Doifen sukkah is a chefze de mitzvah. A sukkah is not kosher unless it has shtayim v'tefach or sholosh v'tefach. And that's halacha l'Moshe Messinai. So a sukkah is not only schach, it's the tfanis as well. So how could you use an elephant, which is an impure animal? It's a chaye tameya. So the Noida wants to prove from here, lo kedivrei aramo. But the Ramo is the Ran. And we are quite confident that the Mogan Avram, the Ramo, and the Ran did not overlook a Gemara in Sukkot Avchov Gimel. So how could you make the wall of a sukkah, one of the tfanas of a sukkah, from an elephant, which is a chayet tamei, lo yuchsharu la melech hashamayim ela or be'em toira belvad. So Rabbi Shmuel Ando in his Shuvah writes a Haggah. La'achar shonem rabbis nizgala li chiluk b'svora. And he makes a powerful point, and he says, HaMutar B'ficha is only when the chefze de mitzvah must necessarily come from a living creature. Like hide. Hide doesn't grow on trees. Neither do horns grow on trees. So the shofar necessarily comes from an animal. And therefore there are pure animals and impure animals. Chayes Sabeis, Chayes Toiris. HaMutar B'ficha says it must be a Chayet Torah. The same hide. Hide must come from a Chayet Torah. But the doifen of a sukkah could be made out of metal, out of wood, out of glass, out of rock, out of anything. And therefore there is no din HaMutar B'ficha. It's an interesting formula. Nizgaleli chiluk b'svora. Chiluk b'svora is not a revelation. So let me tell you the story. There's a Sefer Birkas Moshe written by one of the Talmidim of the Noida B'Yehuda. His name was Reb Moshe Caramel. And in his Sefer he writes that I heard from Reb Shemuel Yedidi, the son of our great Rebbe, the Noida B'Yehuda, that his father came to him in a dream. And he said, your kasha that you wrote in my Sefer is not a kasha. Exactly this svara. Doifen sukkah doesn't need to be from a living creature. And therefore there is no din of HaMutar B'ficha. I think Reb Shmuel Ando, for some reason, didn't want to tell the story of this dream. And therefore he uses some language. Nizgalali chilik b'svara. But the story becomes even more interesting. Reb Moshe Caramel writes, I was so nana from Reb Shmuel Ando, so I shared the story of his father coming to him in a dream and teaching him a svara with my friends, and that very same night, the Noida B'Yehuda came to me in my dream and asked me to print and publicize this svara. Interesting. Minchas Osher Chumash Bereishis is one of the last simonim. I apologize, I don't remember which simon it is. Many times I apologize. When I quote many svarim with the exact simon, it's Gersa di Yankusa. When I was a young man, there was no Minchas Osher, and that's why I don't remember the Minchas Osher as good as I remember many other svarim and many other sources. But towards the end of Minchas Osher Bereishis, there's a simon about Divrei Chaloimis. And I brought many, many sources. I did not bring this one. Rav Moshe Caramel telling the story that the Noida B'Yehuda came in a dream to his son to teach him a svara, which is interesting. Are there any other mitzvahs where we find a discussion? What did we touch upon? Tefillin, that's the basic Gemara. Beis Hamikdash, Rabbeinu Bachayei, Ravid, Rambam. Shofar, That's the Ran. Psak of the Namotov Kuf Peivav, Mogan Avram Siv Kotten Gimel. Then we spoke about the Me'il of a Sefer Torah, the Chsam Soifer, and Doifen Asuka. How about Ner Shabbos? In the Mishnah Chaf Amud Beis, Ein Madlika B'Shem and Kik. Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, the Gemara says, what's Shem and Kik? It's a bird. It's a bird, and from the oil that we take out of that bird's body, you cannot be Madlik Ner Shabbos. And why not? Is that bird a kosher bird or a non-kosher one? Chulin Samach Gimel. In the din of Kashrus Uoifis, we find that the kick is a oif tomei. So why doesn't the Gemara simply say you can't be Madlik Ner Shabbos? Because it's not HaMutar B'ficha. Ner Shabbos is a mitzvah. So how could you use shemen that originates in a non-kosher bird? That's a question many achronim ask. Maratz Chayes, Shabbos Daf Chaf Aleph. How about Ner Chanukah? One of Reb Shlomo Kluger's amazing svarim is Shalas Yeshuvah Shnois Chaim. The Akdoma to the Sefer is called Derech Chaim. And Derech Chaim, there are Harbe Drochim L'Mokoim. Derech Aleph Derech Chaim, the Sefer Shnois Chaim, Reb Shlomo Kluger discusses Ner Chanukah, and one of the ingredients of the oil was fat from a pig. Is it kosher? I'd look at Ner Chanukah. And he wants to be Machadish. There are mitzvah in which the chefs of the mitzvah is consumed. When you perform the mitzvah, there is no kpeidim and HaMutar B'ficha. Svara mechudeshes. His feeling is HaMutar B'ficha is only when the chefza is permanent. But shemen which is consumed, when you're Madlik Ner Shabbos and Chanukah, there is no kpeidim. I don't appreciate the svara. Meichet teisa. V'chi darshin and tam and the kroz. It's a kosher. You cannot have a chefza the mitzvah which is machoras esura. It's hard for me to accept this svara of Reb Shlomo Kluger. Shoyel Meishiv, Madurat Inyon Chelak Aleph Siman Ayin Vav, deals with a kasha that we find in Noida B'Yehuda. Even Ezer, Madurat Inyon Kuf Nun Beis Kuf Nun Gimel. I quoted two tshuvas of Noida B'Yehuda before, and these are two other ones. The Noida B'Yehuda is Kuf Nun Beis, the son of Reb Shmuel is Kuf Nun Gimel. Toises Yavom Eskuv Beis quotes Rabbeinu Tam. Sandal shel chalitza needs to be from a Chayat Torah. Why? Posek Novi va'an alcho tachash. Tachash is a Chayat Torah. So the Noida would ask, why don't we simply say Min HaMutar B'ficha? Chalitza is a mitzvah. How could the chefsa mitzvah be from a Chayat Tameya? According to the dream of Reb Shmuel Lando, well, a shoe doesn't necessarily need to be from hide, from an animal. Could be min hatzomeach, could be rubber. So there is no din of HaMutar B'ficha. But the Shoyel Meishiv comes up with another svara, which is a good svara, Misyashav Aleiv, and he says, it is only mitzvahs chiyuviyos, which are essentially avodas ukel, that there is a din of HaMutar B'ficha, like shofar, like tefillin. But the mitzvah of chalitza is not a mitzvah chiyuvis. It's just to be matir the isho l'nesuyin. A woman can't marry unless she gets either yibum or chalitza. It's like a get. You could write a get on anything, even on the hide of a non-kosher animal, on klaf that comes from any animal. So get and chalitza are similar. The Beis Yitzchok, Yoredeh Kuf Mem Hei, asks a gewaltige kasha. Megillas Soita. Tosfos Soita Yud Zayin in the base quotes a Yerushalmi. We cannot write the Megillah Soita on klaf of a Chayat Tameya. Why? Because the Soita might say Eini Shaisa, and then we'll be left with a Megillah that's written on klaf Tamei. The Beis Yitzchak wants a proof from this Yerushalmi, the Svar of Reb Shlomo Kluger. If the chefza is consumed when performing the mitzvah, there is no kpeida of HaMutar B'ficha. So you write Megillah Soitan Klaf, and then you're Moichek Alamayim. So it's destroyed. There isn't a din of HaMutar B'ficha. But I said before, it's hard to accept the Svara. According to the Shiur the Svara is simple. It's not a mitzvah of avodas ukeil. It's not a mitzvah chiyuvis. It's not a mitzvah which is roivet zakar kafta de gavra. It's only in the sad circumstances of a cheshad of soita that we use Megillah Soita. So Megillah Soita, Sanal Shel Charitza, get are the same. And then the Shiur goes to an extreme. Maybe the same would refer to Ner Shabbos. Ner Shabbos is not a mitzvah kiyumis. But essentially it's all about Sholem Bayis, it's all about Kvoid Shabbos. So maybe by Ner Shabbos there also is not the din of Min HaMutar B'ficha. But Ner Chanukah is a chiyuv, and the chiyuv is Persum Menisa. So regarding Ner Chanukah, according to everything we said, yes, it needs to be Min HaMutar B'ficha. Do we have anything else on our list? Yes. Two gewaltige kashes. Menochas Lametes. The Gemara says you could make tzitzis out of meshi, out of silk. If the garment is silk, the tzitzis could be made of silk. Tzemer and Pishtan pater any garment. But other garments, if the tzitzis is the same type as the garment, so if you have a beged dalat kanf from silk, you could make tzitzis of silk. Min HaMutar B'ficha. If Rabbeinu Bachya says you can't make big dekona out of silk because silk is produced by worms that are shrotzim, that are osa bechila, so you could make tzitzis out of silk. That's a big kasha. So maybe we would say tzitzis is also a mitzvah kiyumis. If you don't wear dalet kanfis, you're not mechuyev b'tzitzis. That's the Minchas Chinuch, very famous Minchas Chinuch, Shin Chov Dalet. He writes, there is no din of mitzvah b'aveda by sukkah or by tzitzis because you're not mechuyev b'sukkah only if you eat achilas kva. You're not mechuyev b'tzitzis only if you put on dalet kanfis. But I disagreed with the Minchas Chinuch. Once again, Minchas Osha Moyadem Chelak Aleph. I do not remember which siman. So, how would I be miyashav the kasha of Meshi? The Chsam Soifer has another gewaltige kasha. Yoredei Reish Pei. Steht in Shulchan Aruch that the minig is to be toifer yorias of Sefer Torah b'meshi, b'chutei meshi. And that's part of the chefs of a Sefer Torah. You need to sew the yorias one to another. And the Shulchan says, we use meshi. Those are two gewaltige kashas from Sefer Torah and from tzitzis. Ibididi Talia. If I would have my way, I would say a Pashati aside that is miyashav almost all the kashas and all the difficulty I discussed today. I think the din of Min HaMutar B'ficha refers only when we are trying to use an actual part of the body of a chaya tameya. But when we use a substance that is produced by a chaya tameya, but it's not part of its basic body, there is no din of Min HaMutar B'ficha. So what are the two relevant sources in the Sugya of Min HaMutar B'ficha? One is the Gemara and the other is the Ran and the Ramah. Retzuas atfilin or behemet tameya, shoifer shel behemet tameya. The skin of an animal is part of its body. Hide is part of an animal's body. It's the most obvious part of the body. It's the skin. Horns are an essential part of an animal's body, growing on its head. That is the din of Min HaMutar B'ficha. Silk produced by worms. Regarding machonas asurais kol hayotzim min hatomei tomei, but the din of Min HaMutar B'ficha does not apply. And that is the teretz on toilas shoni, on meshi, on tcheles, because the fluid that we use from the chalazon is not part of its body. It's produced by the animal. It grows in the animal. That's the teretz on more. Only a solid part of an animal's body is posol lemitzvah lemaleches shemayim and HaMutar B'ficha. And that includes shofar and ritzuas atfilin. And I think it's a chilek poshut. Now, I can't convince her betam advor. I'm not always do I understand the tam, but it needs to be reasonable. HaMutar B'ficha is a gzeres hakosov. Maybe in a way it is similar to bizui mitzvah, sepasnisht, that we use a davar tomoy for kiyum mitzvah. What I argue is, ein lechu boi ela chadushay. And this then refers when you're using an actual essential part of a chayet tameya. And maybe it needs even to be nikar. But mor meshi, tola shoni, tzeva hatcheles, they are not an essential part of the body. They grow in the body. They're produced by the worms. They're interchangeable. And therefore the din of HaMutar B'ficha doesn't apply. And that is also miyashav shem and kik. It's not an integral, basic, obvious, evident part of the body of a chayet tameya. Kach hoyo nera lanias daiti. So I find this to be an interesting sugya, bringing all the sources together and trying to analyze what are the limits of the din min HaMutar B'ficha. Medrash Tanchuma this week's parsha. Ein bekol hakarbonos chovev kemo haktoides. So this week we lead Parshas Tetzaveh. And a thought on the parsha is already out of Shabbos. Ein bekol hakarbonos chovev kemo haktoides. Teida lacha. Shenasa Mishkan v'kol kele v'shuchet es kol hakarbonos v'hikra v'orach al hamezbech v'sidra sholach me'zamanoi v'sakol v'lo yordu shchino ad shektiru es haktoides. It is only the Torahs that brought the Shekhinah down. But the Medrash doesn't explain what is unique about Chodesh. But the Zohar does. Zohar HaKodesh, Chele Gimel Reish Chov Daled. V'leis de botel meisona bi'alme kik Torahs de iu kishure de dina berachamei im reach nechoyach be'af. The Zohar says, nothing has a greater good than Torahs to be mevatel a magefa, a pandemic or an epidemic. Because the Ktoides brings together din and rachamim. Reach nechoyech be'af. Af always symbolizes midas adin. V'choro api bochem. Charoin af. Asher nishbati ba'api. Reach nechoyech is rachamim. Reach nechoyech be'af is the combination of din and rachamim. At the beginning of the pandemic of Corona, of COVID-19, when the disease was raging and people were dying right and left, I said many times, and I wrote in many letters, some of them are printed in Minchas Osher on Corona, which came out almost a year ago. And I recommended and I plead, everybody should say Parshas Ektoides B'kol Yom. Because the Zohar says, lace the bottle moisona ba'alma kiktoides. We trust the Zohar, and the Zohar says there is no greater zgula to be mevatel and magefa. And the Ramban in this week's Parshas, the Ramban writes, Zeraz shenimsel Moshe Rabbeinu shektoides otzeres hamagefa ki aktoides b'midas adin shenemar yosim ektoire ba'apecha min v'choro api. I think the Ramban alludes to the Zohar. But the Ari HaKodesh in Lekutei Torah Parshas V'Zayis Brocha takes us a step further. And I read the text. Yasimu K'Torah B'Pecho Rosh HaTeves Yaboik. Yasimu K'Torah B'Pecho. Shu Yichud Havaya V'Elokim. Yabik is 112. That is the numerical value of Shem Elokim and Shem Havaya. Havaya is Rachmim, Elokim is Din. V'zeh Sod HaKtoros Lematek Kol HaDinim, to sweeten all the dinim. So we have the Ramban Dari, and most important, the Zohar. And in my Svora, Minchas Osha Moedim, I quoted many times from Sidur Hagro. Kedusha de Sidra, Asher Voratzina, the Posek Lamenetzech, Begvuros Yesh Yaminoi, and the Gorn wonders, Gvuros is Din, Yamin is Rachamim, Small is Din, Yamin Rachmim, Small Doich, Yamin Mekareves. So how does the Posek say Begvuros Yesh Yaminoi? And the Gorn says, the greatest Rachamim are the Rachamim that comes out of Midas Adin. And that is why in the second Broch of the Shmoynes, which is defined Berchas Agvuris, we say Machalke L'chaim B'chesed. So when we could bring Midas Adin to be Mashpia Rachamim, that's the greatest Rachamim in the world. And that's the Sod of Ktoiris, Yaboik, the combination of Havaya and Elokim. Reach Nechoyach Ba'api. And there's an other Zohar, Chelek Aleph Daf Reish Lamed. And the Zohar says, B'shas Tfilas Mincha, when day goes down to night, that is the biggest Midas Adin, and that is why David HaMelech, and that very hour by Tfilas Mincha says, Tikoin Tfilosi Ktoires Lefonecho Masas Kape Mincha Sola, because Ktoires is Mematek Es Hadinim. That is the Zgula of Ktoires. And it is not only Aktoris, Riacha Shechorav Beis HaMikdash, saying Pashas Aktoris has the same effect. And it is the same Segula. That is what we learn in Zohar. And that is what we find in Kaf HaChaim, not the Kaf HaChaim HaGoan Rav Sofer, but Kaf HaChaim from Reb Chaim Palagi. And Kaf HaChaim Reb Chaim Palagi, Siman Yud Zayin. And we find the same in Ben Ishchai, Miketz, Shona Rishoyna. And it's not only the Sfari Gedolim, the Bnei Yissaschar, Agra, the Percha, Lamed Vav. When we say the Pash of Pitam Aktoiris, Din is transformed into Rachamim. And it's the greatest Gula against Magefis. My dear friends, COVID is still with us. Not as bad as it was in the past, but people are dying. People are dying. One of the members of my shul, a young person relatively, is desperately ill. Chaim Liron ben Ita Idit. People are dying. And many people are badly ill. So I still strongly recommend and beg to say Parshas Aktoides B'Kol Yoim. You know, there are many Zgunas. But who is more reliable than Reb Shimon Bar Yochai when it comes to Zgulas than the Zohar? And as I quoted, the Zohar clearly says, Leis the bottle meisona ba'almo k'ktoiris. Nothing is more effective than ktoiris. So I think we should all, those that started and stopped, start again. To say every day Parshas Ktoiris, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Yosef Machla Umegefa Me'al Amoy Beis Yisrael. We should share B'Sodas Tovis and have a beautiful Shabbos. Kol Tov.